Um, I would like to first start out by briefly sharing a little bit about myself, just a thumbnail sketch background. I'm a second-generation Korean American, and I grew up attending a Korean church that was more of my extended family than simply a church family. Perhaps many of you can relate to that experience. For my family, we had no other family in the United States, and so the church family became our family. This church had an active English ministry program that continues to thrive, and some of the elements of success that Peter Cha refers to in his chapter, Constructing New Intergenerational Ties, Cultures, and Identities Among Korean American Christians, remind me of the church in which I grew up. For example, the social, spiritual, and fiscal ownership that the English ministry congregants have taken of their church and the mutual respect that is given between the Korean ministry and English ministry church leaders have been instrumental in the success of the church overall. Whenever I visit the church, I'm impressed to see how well the English ministry has flourished amidst many seasons of transition. In my own faith journey, however, I've arrived at a different place from where I began. In the last 5 years, my husband and I have been part of the Anglican Church. Among other things, we are drawn to the liturgical worship, the sacramental perspective, and the recitation of creeds. And as I honestly reflect upon this journey, it is clear to me that being in the Anglican Church has much more to do with my and my husband's conviction to attend a liturgical church than it has to do with not being in the Asian American Church. And while I feel at home at the Korean church in a way that I never, ever feel in other churches, I have chosen to be where I am based on faith tradition rather than ethnic cultural tradition. The little that I've shared about myself directly relates to the two themes that emerged for me in Dr. Tran's talk. In the section titled, "And Over Against," Dr. Tran states, "This over against will leave us each thinking that we are now left to fend for ourselves, that we are not part of something bigger. We don't seek to learn and partner with others because we keep forgetting there are others. We don't commingle with others because we have learned to understand our identity not as a mutual gathering, but an over against." Here I understood you to be talking about Asian American churches in the context of a society that segregates rather than communes and integrates. I would like to offer, being a therapist that I am, a reframe of this isolated example, or this isolated insular image of the Asian American church. The perhaps unintended function, but profound benefit and example of God's faithfulness of the Asian American church for first-generation immigrants is to provide a place of healing and belonging in addition to spiritual nourishment. For example, I've never attended a Korean church that didn't serve potluck at the end of every service. During potluck, people are at once physically and emotionally fed, and church life comes alive. Church life provides opportunities for congregants to participate in community life in a unique way. So many of our immigrant parents gave up their status when they came to America. Physicians became liquor store owners, and those who once wore suits became the ones who dry cleaned other suits. It is in the church that members have status as elders and deacons, and for some, it is one of the only places where they have a sense of place, dignity, and respect. The Korean church that I grew up in was more than a place of worship for my family. Beyond being a spiritual home, it was our extended family and a place of belonging amidst the psychological homelessness that plagued my immigrant parents and many of their peers. It was one of the only places in our family life where there was a profound sense of solidarity and connection that in many ways provided healing for the feelings of displacement and loneliness that was so common for immigrants like my parents. I'm reminded of the phrase, "La cultura cura," which is not Korean, it's Spanish, interestingly, and it means the curing culture. This refers to more than healing rituals and traditions that are embedded in one's culture. More importantly, in my mind, it refers to the healing and curing that comes from simply being among your own and having a sense of belonging and connection in your own culture. This is not to imply that church merely functions as a social club or a community center. At the center of it all should, of course, be the gospel and all the ministries that flow from the truth of the gospel. This reframe, if you will, is important to keep in mind if we want to talk about a way to preserve Asian American churches in a meaningful way. We need to acknowledge and understand the multiple values and functions within the Asian American church, namely the value for intergenerational reconciliation and healing, the value for spiritual nurturance, the value for preserving and passing down traditions, and the value of providing cultural solidarity. Here, we can honor both the value of the Asian American church as cultural safe haven of the first-generation congregants, while exploring ways to make the church meaningful and positive for subsequent generations as well. Now I'd like to move on to the second issue, which for me relates directly to my own faith journey. A significant issue that Dr. Tran touches upon that I believe deserves further exploration is the extent to which the phenomena that Dr. Tran observes in the Asian American church parallel current trends in the broader evangelical church. As a marriage and family therapist, excuse me, I am trained to think contextually and to conceptualize issues in systemic terms. Thus, examining different systems and understanding how they perhaps operate in parallel process helps me make sense of the complex dynamics and also provides information about how to work with these systems. In the section titled A Separation From, Dr. Tran talks about the business model of the emerging Asian American church and the ways in which Asian American Christianity, I'm quoting, Asian American Christianity mimics white Christianity. Dr. Tran discusses ways that Asian American Christianity is in lockstep with the broader evangelical church by, to put it simply, tending to favor innovation over tradition when it comes to modes of worship and ways of doing ministry. The cultural critic and commentator Ken Myers, host of the audio journal Mars Hill Audio, has a lot to say about the issue of tradition and history in the church. In one of the audio issues, excuse me, he references a number of scholars on this topic. From the late Colin Gooten, he quotes, "Tradition involves a personal relatedness to others in both past and future time. To deny the salutary character of tradition is to say that we can only be ourselves by freeing ourselves from others by suppressing the other, rather than being set free by them." End quote. Also the theologian Stephen Holmes, "Because of the doctrine of creation, historical locatedness is something good. The tradition we inherit is part of our location in history, and so in doing theology, it is necessary to relate to the tradition." And finally, Dr. Tran, your own colleague, D.H. Williams, who poignantly captures what you've been saying, the growing indifference of the free church, and especially non-denominational congregations, to the founding period of the church's understanding of orthodox belief threatened to result in growing subjectivism in theology. Bereft of historical points of reference of accommodating the church to a pseudo-Christian culture such that the uniqueness of the Christian identity is quietly and unintentionally traded away in the name of effective ministry. Here, these scholars were not and are not necessarily talking about the Asian American church, and yet their words and their meanings resonate with much of Dr. Tran's critique. First and foremost, it is imperative that we recognize the situation of the Asian American church as being located within a larger system that is in parallel process. Perhaps recognizing this parallel is one way to make the Asian American church relevant to the Christian Academy, who, according to Dr. Tran, considers the Asian American church to be irrelevant. It is important to examine the parallels between Asian American churches and the broader American evangelical church, because we understand that the Asian American church is not isolated, but rather is connected to the larger evangelical church that is dealing with some of the same challenges of stepping away from its history in an effort to make church relevant to the current generation. In family systems terms, when one part of the system changes, all other parts are affected, much like a mobile. Thus, we cannot afford to understand our situation and seek out a solution without recognizing the role the Asian American church plays in the larger evangelical community and vice versa. So in closing, reading through Dr. Tran's talk and preparing for my response conjured up more questions than answers. In what ways are other non-Asian American churches grappling with these same issues? Is there a way to be unified as one body in our efforts without losing our unique identities? Is there such thing as Asian American Christianity apart from white European Christianity? And if so, what does that look like? I would take it a step further and say, is there such thing as Asian Christianity apart from white European Christianity? How does a community of believers retain their cultural identity through traditions, values, and practices while holding firmly to the traditions, values, and practices of the Christian faith? And finally, how do we approach this as both and, as opposed to either or, without distilling either part? Thank you.